Hello and welcome to our podcast, Narratives and Imaginaries from South Asia. In this podcast, we hope to be in conversations with ordinary people and talk about the different forms of emergent crisis that South Asia is currently being riddled with. In locating these conversations in people like us, we hope to talk about power, structure, and what they mean for the everyday lives of people. This podcast is hosted by three of us, Sumedha Basu, Moli Banerjee, and me, Rohini Sen. All of us are researchers and scholars currently based in the United Kingdom. For our first guest today, we have Danushka Medawatte. Danushka Medawatte is a Global Challenges doctoral scholar at Kent Law School and has had extensive teaching experience back in Colombo as a human rights scholar and activist. Today, she joins us to talk about her perspectives and reflections about the current crisis in Sri Lanka, about what is happening on the ground, and her hopes, aspirations, and thoughts on some of these things. Danushka, thank you so much for joining us. So, tell us a little about your PhD journey so far. You've arrived here in the UK, your family is currently in Sri Lanka, and given everything that is going on, tell us a little about the journey so far.
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you, Sumedha, for having me. First of all, I do not know where to begin about my journey of the PhD so far. I have not even completed 1 year, but I've had a lot of challenges in terms of getting accustomed to a new academic life. PhD in and of itself is a challenge. And I'm here as a single mother, single South Asian mother with a brown skin, which adds a lot of nuances into how people see us, how difficult or how easy it is to engage in our work. So that has given me a lot of challenges in terms of even finding housing. Even before I came here, that was the first challenge that I faced. And when I was facing that challenge, I got in touch with my two wonderful supervisors, Dr. Rose Parfit and Dr. Suraya Jibraj, who have helped me quite a bit, even in terms of finding houses, which is not their job to do. Even after finding houses like that, after I came here, I had to face massive racist attacks from my neighbors where I was initially located, which rendered my 4-year-old daughter and I homeless for a while. And it was extremely challenging to find a new house. That was one of the biggest challenges I have faced. I think this was also aggravated by the fact that the political crisis and the economic crisis that is ongoing in Sri Lanka has prevented me from drawing on any of the savings that I have there. So before you come into doing any of your studies in a country like the United Kingdom, you're legally expected to open something called the student file in one of the Sri Lankan banks where you maintain a student account so that you can pull out a particular amount of pounds or dollars or whatever the currency it is that you want to draw from it. I have done that in accordance with the law very properly months before I came here, and it should technically allow me to draw funds from it that should suffice to pay for my renting arrangements here. But I have so far not been able to draw a single pound in accordance with that agreement because of the economic crisis. So that has given me a lot of challenges in terms of, balancing my ability to be here and do my studies here. In terms of the academic work that I'm doing, I'm actually working on ethnicity, gender, and transitional justice, particularly because these are the areas that I have worked on in Sri Lanka, and I have 10 years of working experience working with the communities, especially from the former war-affected communities and all parts of the world, all parts of the country rather, for the past 10 years. And from those experiences, I have drawn the understanding at the moment that transitional justice doesn't necessarily cater to some of the requirements at the grassroots levels. So that is what I'm trying to test out and see whether I could go somewhere with that kind of argumentation. So those are the initial challenges that I've had in terms of coming to the UK and trying to begin my work as someone who is starting out on a PhD.
Thanks, Anushka. That was really interesting, actually. I just wanted to understand. I mean, you mentioned about the challenges that you're facing here, but there must be, tremendous amount of challenges that your family is facing in Sri Lanka right now. Would you like to just walk us through it? I mean, what is it like living in Sri Lanka right now, and what are regular people going through?
Absolutely, yes. I think one of the biggest crises that we are facing right now is the economic crisis, and that's not something that we have seen in our lifetime, not even in my parents' or grandparents' generation. and people are back to cooking with firewood. These are people who have had for over half a century access to other mechanisms of cooking. And imagine, some people who have access to a backyard perhaps can do something like that. But Colombo and other certain other areas like Gaul, Mathura, Kandy, and even certain parts of northern and eastern provinces have become quite urbanized over the years. And if at all these people live on flats, it's going to be absolutely impossible for you to be able to have something like firewood or a kerosene cooking device for you to cook on. And I have seen some of my friends posting on Facebook saying that for days they had just had to give their kids fruits because they had no other way of cooking anything for them. And that too also has a class dynamic. You can give fruits if you have a particular amount of income coming into your family. And we see photographs of children going into schools, teachers taking photographs of their food and posting them online, with the children just having some boiled rice, steamed rice, with some green leaves. That's all. They don't have any curries to eat it with, because Sri Lankans generally eat with, two or three curries, maybe two, three types of vegetables, some type of meat. And of course, that is very, very less when it comes to the bottom economic rungs of the society anyway. And what has happened during this crisis is that it has completely demolished certain groups of people in Sri Lanka. People are dying of starvation. We hear stories of mothers throwing kids into the rivers because they have no food to feed them. We hear of older people and even younger people dying on petrol queues because petrol queues last for days. I have my own father not being able to use his vehicle. I have my brother in law standing in petrol queues for over 3 days in order to get some petrol, and he has now given up trying to do it. My elderly mother is pressed to cook with firewood. Obviously, that brings up other challenges like health challenges. And on the other hand, we have politicians trying to tell the ordinary people there are health advantages of cooking on firewood. So it's tragic comedy on many different levels. And those are some of the challenges with regard to food and money. But there are also massive number of challenges with regard to people's ability to access life-saving medicine, that for premature babies who are born, for pregnant women, for people with heart disease. These are three of the areas that I've been hearing quite a lot about. And recently I had a very nice colleague of my own university, Yanitra Kumaraguru, having a campaign for her birthday to collect money and spend on some of these activities. People do a lot of these things. People who have the capacity, sometimes people who don't even have a lot of capacity, try and muster up the courage and the means to help each other. And that has been absolutely amazing. There is some hope in terms of how people help each other. But at the same time, we have a massive number of people sitting in the parliament not cutting any of their advantages to help anyone at all. So it's absolutely dystopian to talk about what's happening there on the ground. And imagine, there are students from Sri Lanka who are absolutely the cream of the lot, who get into very good universities with very good offers, but are incapable of going for those opportunities anymore, because universities are also saying, okay, well, there's a problem in your country, which means that you will not be able to pay. That means we don't want to have you. Some universities don't allow them to differ. So I know a lot of my own past students who have had to either defer their opportunities or give up on going for their higher education. And on the other hand, we have a massive brain drain. I think that is to be expected. And today also, I saw some in the legal community talking about what are the ramifications of this going to be, because you're not going to be seeing this anytime soon. You're going to be seeing the ramifications of things like this in time to come. Those are the challenges for the adults. And there are also issues that the little kids have, because there are certain nutritious foods that are generally given to people who may not have the economic means, and sometimes it was given very widely to anyone across the board without any economic disparity. particular type of like a powder that you can mix with milk and feed the children. It's a grain kind of powder, and that's not even available to be given to people who are in a lot of need anymore. And on the other hand, schools have been closed for a very, very long time from COVID to now. So essentially, we have kids who have not literally set foot in an actual school for 3 years. And imagine trying to tell a 5-year-old you have to sit in front of a screen and this is your school. Imagine what does that do to the child? What does that do to the teachers? What does that do to the parents? And also the quality of education. What happens to socialization? Forget about academic side of education. What happens to socialization? What happens to young minds? And imagine the economic aspects of that too. If you have money to get a computer, get a tablet, get a fancy phone where you can access these things, then you can. But if you don't have access, then you can't. And I've had instances where I am giving lectures to my students of the Faculty of Law, where students have particularly asked me, please do not ask me to switch on my camera. I don't want people to see my background. I've had students telling me, I have never missed a lecture, but I'm not going to be able to come for your lecture because we don't have enough strength in our internet. I've had colleagues from the single medium tell me that there are students who climb onto rooftops, climb onto trees, or go into open fields just so that they can have access to internet, so that they can access the lectures. So these are some of the issues. It makes me very, very sad to talk about it, because I never thought that I will have to talk about my country in this way
Indeed.
outside it. Yeah.
And what about you? I mean, one aspect you mentioned about is the economic aspect, but there is also a social side to it. Are you able to visit your family, your child, going back to Sri Lanka? Is that even a possibility in the near future?
I think Rohini and I had this conversation a couple of days ago in a private context as well, because I was very sad to remain in the UK during August, because nobody is going to be here and there is not going to be much that I can do here. But of course, there's a price hike. It would cost me nearly 1 million in Sri Lankan rupees to go back, just for me and the child. And if I do that for a 1 month period, then there are also problems about whether I would even have access to proper food for my child when I go back, because she's very tiny. She was a premature baby. She has issues in terms of her physical development as well, in terms of gaining weight. So she's used to a particular type of diet, and I'm absolutely not going to be able to give it to her there. I understand that I come from a position of privilege here, that there are many mothers like me in Sri Lanka who are unable to give to their children what they want to give, and it absolutely breaks my heart. I haven't seen my parents for a year, and my father and my mother want to come visit me here, and my father had lost his passport. He's unable to get a new passport because the passport queues start at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there are women giving birth at the passport queue. You may imagine that this sounds like some dystopian movie, because who is going to give birth to a child on a queue? But it does happen in Sri Lanka because the status is so bad. Even when you apparently apply, I don't know this because I haven't tried it, but if you apply to have your passport online, they are unable to give you a date on which you can come and collect it, or the date on which you can come and give your biometric details, because there's such a demand for passports, and there's such a demand for the educated lot or the capable lot of Sri Lanka to try and get out of the country for jobs, education, and anything else that might come up. So in answer to your question, Sumedha, I don't know when I'm going to be able to see my family.
Thank you so much. That's just such a difficult narrative to listen to, and must be equally difficult for you, if not more, for you to share it. Uh, Anushka, we're going to take a step back, and I was wondering if you could reflect on the political situation in Sri Lanka, not just as a PhD student and an individual who's enduring all this, but as an academic and a scholar, just for a minute, if you will. How has the political situation evolved since this particular regime came to power? And now that we find ourselves in this current moment of crisis, so
Yeah.
a little bit on that.
I think, Rohini, that's a very interesting question, but the word I'm not probably going to call it an evolution, because evolution is supposed to work in a very different angle than what is happening in Sri Lanka at the moment. And I am unable to even talk about the present context without talking about the events that have led up to it. And I think we need to sort of go back and look at the end of the armed conflict and the narratives that were beginning at that particular point of time, because there was a lot of what we in Sri Lanka call Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. Sinhala is happened to be the numerically majoritarian community, of which a major part happens to be Buddhists, and the other two main minority communities, numerical minority communities, happen to be Tamil and the Muslims. Of course, we have a lot of other communities as well, but the significant problems have almost always been amongst the Sinhalese, the Tamils, and the Muslims, and particularly the armed conflict between the state armed forces, primarily made up of the so-called Sinhala Buddhists, and then the members of the Liberation Tigers of the Tamil Elam, which happens to be from the Tamil community. Right after the end of the armed conflict, there was a massive narrative that was developed by the politicians trying to attract people into a Sinhala Buddhist nationalistic agenda. And that was to draw on the older kings and say the country has always been the guardian of Buddhism, and you need to have a Sinhalese ruler, and the Sinhalese ruler has to be heteronormatively ticking all sorts of boxes, have to be married, have to have kids. A lot of things have been used, even among the politicians, to sling mud at each other. So one of the issues that happened with all of these narratives coming into play was that there was a lot of work that was being done at the grassroots level to undermine some of the very real challenges people faced at the grassroots level. Of course, the valid questions that were asked by the minority communities were being swept under the carpet. And it was even challenging for someone like me, who happens to be from the numerical majority community, to go and work with communities, because I had my own challenges, my own community calling me a traitor for working with the quote unquote minority communities, and some of the minority communities rejecting me for being a member of the majority community. Imagine being in that situation, because it gives you an existential crisis. So after this, there came a point where people were voting in favor of this majoritarian Sinhala Buddhist kind of narrative. But at one point, people were pushing for a change of governance, change of way things were being done. And there was this push for recognizing the harms that occurred during the armed conflict. And that led to something called the good governance arrangement. And that came into being with a push for having a transitional justice agenda as well. But during this administration, I mean, although I say this administration, that administration, one thing that we need to understand is that this is the same lot of people who are just changing parties, and it's not even mix and match. It's just the same lot that is changing their names, titles, positions, and keep coming back. And obviously, the quote unquote good governance government also couldn't perform what they said that they would perform. And that also led to massive aggravation of other problems that the Sinhalese and the Muslim communities have been having for some time. Of course, these problems began right after the end of the war. These have been in existence for a long time, but they got more aggravated after the end of the war. And during the good governance government, we had the so-called Easter Sunday attacks, where Christian churches were bombed, and Easter Sunday breakfast and brunches were bombed in very well-known hotels, and that led to a lot of deaths inside the churches, inside the hotels. There were so many people who have been permanently disabled, and there was nothing done by anyone in power. No proper inquiry. Of course, I should also flag here, even the inquiries, commissions of inquiry that we have had many, and that makes for good reading if you're unable to fall asleep at night. But that's about it. That has not done anything good for anyone. None of these commissions of inquiry have done anything for the people. Most of them have just been published and then forgotten. Even the ones that have had good recommendations, the politicians who appointed these commissions themselves have sometimes swept these under the carpet when the recommendations were actually good, and when the commissioners were actually working with a lot of integrity to state the truth in some of these commissions of inquiry. So there was no such thing that was done. And on a mandate of national security, security, the government of former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into being. And they managed to get a lot of votes. I assume that was because of the national security agenda that was put forward. And there was a valid reason why people would buy into that, because there have been massive bombing attacks just 10 years after the war had ended. And nobody wants to live in that kind of fear anymore. But what they did in terms of garnering two-thirds majority, even in the parliament after that, they had absolutely failed to cater to what the people wanted. You can see a massive decay in rule of law. You can see a lot of political appointments in various institutions, be it the judiciary, be it in higher educations of academia. And people's revolt was understandable, but sometimes you may wonder whether this understandable revolt stems from a economic sense and not from the other all of the other amalgamated issues that we are talking of here. So that also goes to the root causes of why don't people rise up when you have so many human rights violations, and then the moment that you have nothing to eat, when you're made to stand in a queue for a couple of days, then you revolt as a community. So we have had this rising up, but that was in effect a people's movement, and that's something that we need to absolutely recognize and appreciate. There was a common cause. The cause was to get the former president out, because there was nothing that he could do in terms of handling the situation. He gave statements to the media saying, this is not a crisis of my making, which I think is an absolutely useless way for a leader of a country to handle a situation. And we don't have a culture of politicians resigning on their own accord. And even if they do resign, and even if they're kicked out of parliament for a while, they do come back, like the scenario that you can see with the current president, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, because he was voted out and he had to come into the parliament through the national list. And now, even after all of the people's struggles and the movements that the people led, you have this individual who had been kicked out of parliament, then coming to the parliament through a very problematic way of a national list, and then making his way up to becoming the prime minister. I'm sorry, I can't remember how many times he has been the prime minister, maybe 6 times, I think. I'm sorry, I really can't remember, because he has been the prime minister for that many times. That should tell you something about it. So now he's the president of Sri Lanka, and that has been supported within the parliament, which is incapable of reflecting the grassroots level realities of Sri Lanka. So this is what the political situation is like in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Danushka. That was really comprehensive, and I think it was a good background for all of us to understand, because none of us really know it in its entirety. But I just wanted to sort of ask you this, that now that we are seeing this revolt, and from my perspective, it almost seems like an organic revolt, bottom up. In some ways, it is also probably unorganized. Where do you see this going? I mean, should we consider this as an inflection point, and do we see the course of Sri Lanka changed significantly? I know we mentioned that the prime minister who's been appointed recently has been there so many times in power, and probably we'll not see as much change as we would have hoped. But in terms of actual economic and political positions, will the government really take a different stance, or will the public really demand for a different stance? How do you see going forward?
Honestly, that's a very difficult question to answer, Sumedha, because I honestly don't know where it will end up going. I think even among the people, you're right, it was an organic struggle and it was bottom up. It was most definitely bottom up, which I think is why that the struggle was able to garner a lot of achievements. They did garner a lot of achievements. They managed to kick out the Rajapaksa regime, at least for the time being. But I don't know whether they will be back in power, because there are a lot of rumors about politicians siding with each other for their own survival, which I think is understandable, because there was a lot going on in terms of the disorganizedness of the struggle itself. Because when something is so organic, when it evolves as it goes, it wouldn't always work in rhythm. It wouldn't always be non-violent, and you can't obviously expect everything to be non-violent all the time. Even if you support non-violence, you have to admit the reality that it might step out of your imagination of what a non-violent struggle should be, or what a struggle should be. So this is exactly what has been happening to the struggle in Sri Lanka as well, because there were violent attacks on some of the houses of the parliamentarians, and there are also allegations that the parliamentarians themselves set fire to them to sort of give a bad name to the struggle, and that people were trying to collect evidence, like these burnt houses actually not having books or furniture or anything that is generally used in a household. And the same happened to the current president, Mr. Vikramasinghe's residence as well. It has been his long-term residence, and there are questions about whether that was set on fire by the people who were actually angry against him, or whether it was done as a part of a political drama. So we don't know the answers to these questions, and we are likely not going to ever know. And in terms of whether the state is going to do anything about it, the reason why I said it's difficult to assume is because one of the problems with almost every single, no, let me take back the word almost. One of the problems with all of the rulers that we have had in Sri Lanka is that every single one of them has used rule by emergency. So this stems from a very old law in the Public Securities Ordinance, which allows the president, who is the executive president, to use public security and bring massive emergency regulations, which give them a lot of power to wield. And that's extremely problematic, because under these sets of laws, you also have things like the Terrorism Act, which has been troubling the Tamil community for a very, very long time. People have been arrested, kept in remand, kept in custody without any communication to the families, to the lawyers, no representation, sometimes them being forced to sign confessions that are written in languages that they don't understand. Some of these cases also finding their way into international levels like the Human Rights Committee. And all rulers who do use emergency power do certain things which are very, very common. One is censorship. And even if there are no actual rules saying you censor yourself, people have a sense of danger, which makes them self-censor. And I see that happening quite a bit, even amongst friends and colleagues who were very vocal just a month ago. And that's a very troubling trend, because I know for a fact that some of these individuals have very different views, and they would have gone on to talk about them publicly if they were not feeling like their lives would be in danger. And of course, it doesn't help that the current president has literally told that the struggling crowd are fascists. And it makes one wonder, what meaning do you give to fascism? And how do you understand it? Is it only fascism when people revolt? What about fascism that is done by states? So how do you understand something like that? So these are some of the issues. And then during the conversations that almost every presidential hopeful was having, one of the things, of course, this may be an unpopular opinion. I don't intend to speak for my community or everybody in Sri Lanka. This is strictly personal. But one of the struggles that I had was, I honestly didn't see anyone with an actual implementable plan to get out of the hole that we are in right now. Some were hopeful. I'm sure some had absolutely well-meaning agendas. But as someone who studies law, politics, who likes to look at things from a practical point of view, I am depressed to say I didn't necessarily see anybody with an implementable plan. So this is what I can say to your question, Sumedha, in terms of where the country is going. As far as I can see now, I don't see us coming out of it for the next 5 years at the least. If I do, I'll be very glad. This is me. I mean, this is me not trying to be dystopian or depressed about it, but I think this is the realistic stance that I can adopt as of now.
That's a very, a sharp analysis of a grim reality. I was wondering, this is what happens. What is happening in Sri Lanka is it's not just specific to the political regime or the history, but there does seem to be something about post-colonial constitutionalism at this point where that's sort of an inheritance, and ideas of periodic election, these are very thin measures of democracy. We clearly see that not only are the laws written a certain way, as you mentioned, the rule by emergency, it is a constitutional provision, and it allows the law to transgress in certain ways. And the realization that post-colonial constitutionalism, which at one point was clearly a hopeful project and perhaps no longer is very striking for many of us as individuals living in these spaces, having families there, and also as scholars. So, um, what do you think of that? Tell us a little bit about that, both in terms of your lived reality and the work that you're doing.
I think this is something that the Tamil community has been telling Sri Lanka for a very long time. Just because you have a constitution that you think is the law of the land, that does not represent the grassroots level reality. It does not protect everyone. It does not stand to safeguard people's rights. I think they have been telling this until their throats were bloodied. But nobody wanted to listen because, of course, who cares about the numerical majority? Not numerical minority, rather. So this has been one of the fundamental problems. And you were very correct, Rohini, in saying that these are failures of the colonial democratization project, which we see manifesting in various other ways now. It may not be constitutional projects anymore. It might be something like transitional justice. It might be something like, I don't know, international, setting up international criminal tribunals to look into situations in other countries, whereas, the metaphorical hell is breaking loose in all of the other so-called developed countries as well, because there is no lens to look at themselves. It's always easier to project it elsewhere, look outside. I think one of the issues in these kind of constitutionalization or democratization projects has always been the fact that it has been top down. Initially, it has been from the colonialist point of view. And then when it transferred into the hands of politicians in countries like ours, I think the problem was it only went into the hands of a particular group of people who have studied in a particular way, who dress in a particular way, who talk in a particular way, who think in a particular way. And that particular way is definitely not the way that people think of these things. So the lived reality on the ground is very different to closed door policies that have always been made to tackle these issues. And this is a pervasive issue. The reason why I say it is pervasive is if you look at the, say, the Sinhala Tamil issue in Sri Lanka also, those who come into politics would realize that the conversations are always between the top tier people in the Sinhala community and the top tier people in the Tamil community. By top tier, what I mean is economically powerful, politically powerful people. And yes, obviously you will see that the Sinhala politicians have been able to get their way most of the time. Okay, and you will immediately see something striking about the two communities there. But another reality that you might not always see is that these Tamil politicians have also not been representing what the people want, what the Tamil community wants. If you're talking about the Muslim community, no, once again, the same reality applies there as well. So I think this is something that is extremely problematic. And when we were talking about the coloniality, there is another thing that I think all three of us are interested in, the facet of gender and how that comes into play here. And we have had a lot of laws coming into writing during that time with gendered provisions coming into the law, which perhaps didn't exist before that. So, rules that were relaxed about marriage and property ownership were made rigid with some of these laws. The reason why I talk about it now is, now you have, after the end of the war, you have a lot of Tamil women unable to access their properties because they are not in their name. The spouses are deceased or missing, and these women are incapable of holding property, looking for their property, or selling them, disposing them, because there are laws that prevent them from doing so without the permission of a spouse. Imagine going to get that done in state agencies which have proven to be absolutely inefficient. And that has also created other problems like sexual bribery, which we are trying to tackle through the bribery national action plan, which again reads more like a pamphlet for tourism rather than an actual national action plan for bribery. It's very unfortunate, and these are real truths that happen to be happening at the grassroots level. So, coming back to the question about colonialism and constitution making, it has always been a top down approach. I think now there were several attempts right after the end of the war, because there was an attempt that was made by the good governance government, and also there was an attempt after the Rajapaksa government came into power very recently, once again in 2019. There were attempts to do research at the grassroots level and make that into a report, which would then feed into what happens in the constitution. Just to give you snippets of how this works, when the good governance government came into power, there was a committee that was appointed to undertake comments from the people, and that all of those comments fed into something called the Public Representations Committee report. It is a very good report in terms of sort of showing all of the differences, difficulties, the challenges, and the weaknesses that we face. But the number of responses that they received, I don't think were enough to come into some of the conclusions that they did. Having said that, that was a fairly well drafted report. And then when there was an illusion of people being able to give their comments on what a constitution should be like. Funnily enough, when the time came for the parliament to take it up, the parliament was supposed to divide the committees in accordance with what the report said. But if I remember right, the parliament actually divided committees 2 or 3 days before the report actually came in. So that once again shows there is an illusion of taking into account what the people would say, what the report reports as people saying, and then actually the top most politicians doing whatever that they want to do. And thereafter, under the Rajapaksa regime also, there was an attempt to redraft a constitution. I am not too sure whether any constitutional lawyer worth their salt took the process seriously. I stall on my words saying it because I think I had to choose my words very carefully in saying that. But I think people also have lost faith in terms of some of these committees and the reports and what can you actually do with regard to the constitution. There is now something that I noticed, that a lot of people saying that the constitution is not even relevant. That I think is also a very problematic approach to go by, because that, whatever said and done, is the foundational document which does set some of the rights for us to actually be able to even challenge certain things. If you're going to invalidate the whole thing and say we don't want that constitution at all, we need to have a new one. We have to have a new one before we throw the old document, I would say. I hope I was able to at least answer some aspects of your question, Rohini.
Thank you, Danushka. I mean, I'm not from the legal background, but a lot of what you said made a lot of sense to me and really helpful in terms of rounding up the entire issue. I just wanted to maybe move to one of the last questions we have, and that is about again looking forward. How do we keep hope in this situation, and particularly how do local Sri Lankans keep hope? How do you see what are those snippets of positive things that you hold on to keep up that hope? I'm sorry, I'm not framing this question very well, but and this is also because from what we have discussed, there seems to be very little to hold on to, but I'm sure there is some vision that you hold on to and see that there is some future that you would like to eventually sort of see manifested in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I think you framed the question absolutely well, Sumedha. There was nothing wrong in the way that you framed the question. It's an important question. I think one of the best things that came out of the struggle that the people have been leading for quite a few months now, without giving it up, is that there seems to be a younger generation that is not willing to accept anything that the old politicians will serve them. There is this resolve. We have had enough. of you trying to fool us. You may be able to kill us, you may be able to censor us, but there is also that sense that there is some hope in people holding on to at least some common cause. Of course, you can't expect everybody in the struggle to agree with every tenant of that struggle. It never works like that in any field, I would say, and you don't need to expect it to do that also. So it's very colorful, it's organic, it's bottom up. So that in itself has given it a lot of diversity. And we have seen very heartwarming examples of pregnant women coming onto the struggle. We have seen how nuns and Catholic sisters standing in front of the struggling protesters to save them from water cannons and tear gas. We have also seen how some of the members of the armed forces trying to safeguard people who are attacked with tear gas. Of course, there is a lot of allegations against the armed forces for beating up some of the protesters and injuring them quite badly, and attacking them with tear gas canisters that have expired, and therefore thereby killing some of the strugglers as well. There are these aspects as well. But if you're talking about what do we have to be hopeful, is that the struggle has also opened up a lot of spaces for discussion, and they need to expand. For the very first time in Sri Lanka, there was a pride parade. Because of the struggle, it was possible. And there was once, a couple of years ago, I cannot remember when exactly it happened, perhaps in 2000, somewhere between 2015 and 2019, where the LGBTQ community was called by some of the politicians as the butterflies. And you should see how amazingly these people caught onto that term that was meant to be derogatory and came up saying, yes, we are the butterflies, but we also have votes. We vote. So take us seriously. And I think that was very powerful, because for the first time in Sri Lanka's history, one of the parties went on to say, we will recognize rights of the LGBTQ plus community as well. So these are some of the opportunities that have opened up. And there is a lot of dialogue about getting more women involved in politics too. And I also see a lot of gaps in the current struggle with regard to that. There's a lot of misogyny that is getting thrown around, like the moment that a man does something absolutely stupid, you will dress up the man in women's clothes and say, please get some clothing that has flowers on it, get women's undergarments and wear them. Or comparisons that say, oh, look at this, she is a woman, but she has so much courage, unlike you men. Then some statements like, oh, I wish these men in politics grew a backbone like woman XYZ. So you see a lot of misogyny getting thrown around as well. And one of the other issues that I have had is how even amongst discussions that have happened between the politicians and the strugglers, is that it has been male dominated absolutely badly. But these things are gradually changing. So women in the struggle are pointing them out. There are a lot of women at the front of the struggle, and it has been absolutely amazing to watch the younger generation, especially these young women, coming up and pointing out all of these gaps and saying, look here, we were also there. Our voices need to be heard. We make up over half of this community. Take us seriously. And the LGBTQ community coming up, and the fact that whatever said and done, this is an organic struggle that is bottom up, that has been able to shake up at least some of the politicians. It has happened. There is no doubt about that. And I think it is a point of inflection from that particular point of view. Having said that, I think people need to also be having ways and means of holding on to that hope and working on that hope, rather than becoming discouraged by everything that is happening in the institutions that are supposedly supposed to represent us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and at the same time, just adequately disenchanted answer. I think that sums up the mood that we're in. I read somewhere recently that hope is a form of discipline that you practice every day, especially in times when it is very difficult to muster hope. So I think the insights and the examples that you gave us, especially these sort of moments that are born out of crisis, because the world is desperately in need of new ideas, are probably the way we can hold on to something optimistic and something hopeful. So thank you so much for joining us, participating with us, and sharing some snippets of what life in Sri Lanka looks like at the moment. And we shall be back soon with other editions of our contemplation of crisis in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Danushka.